how much hockey can you actually learn from the hit television show Heated Rivalry? The answer is actually way more than you would expect. For a long time, I've done a series of videos breaking down how much sports you can actually learn from sports romance novels. And I've done these primarily in hockey and F1 because I think those are the two sports that have had so much of a phenomenon of readers turning into sports fans. And it's really undeniable that hockey in particular has had a huge number of female fans come from reading romance novels that are set in the world of hockey. This is something that's been going on for a really long time, but we've never seen something to the scale that we're seeing with Heated Rivalry as a TV show. And I think there are a number of reasons why this show has been so successful, but as someone who comes from a TV production and writing background, I do want to start this breakdown by saying that I think this is the type of show that I lose sleep over not being a part of. It is frankly one of the most well-crafted TV shows that I have seen in years. And I think with 6 episodes, they were able to create something that actually brought people together in a time that we have just not been seeing that. And it is, of course, undeniable that it has had this massive impact on the hockey world itself. A lot of that comes from the NHL trying to capitalize on these new fans and find a way to bring them in, but it honestly has been a really cool experience for me personally, and honestly a really healing experience as someone who has been a fan of hockey for a long time and also recognizes that I'm not necessarily the typical fan that always feels welcome in a stadium. The thing about Heated Rivalry, I think, that has touched me in watching how much it has affected the world of hockey and the world of sports has been seeing on a large scale what I've always hoped my content has done, which is make a group of people who feel excluded from sports feel welcome in a space. And frankly, not necessarily even just feel welcome, but feel entitled to kind of take this space over and make a change. And so my hope is that genuinely we continue to see not only this acknowledgement of the show and this celebration of the show at NHL Pride Nights, inviting actors to come to the games, but also that so many people become fans and become so loud about being fans that certain things are forced to change. All of that being said, how much hockey is really in this show? It's funny because this has been a joke. So many people have said that this show just sort of has a sprinkle of hockey in it. And to be honest, as the show first started to premiere, I did make a video breaking down the hockey that we saw in the first 2 episodes, and I almost felt like we could fit it all in a 3-minute short. However, I also think one of the reasons this show has done such a good job of making people not just love the show, but also investigate hockey as a new fan, is that there's actually a shocking amount of hockey in this show. And while I don't necessarily think that this is a handbook to learn hockey or that the show actually explains every piece of hockey that they share with you, this show is so good that people are watching so many times that they're picking up on these little details, and then they want to know what every little graphic on this show means and what every little piece of kind of commentary that we get from Man on the Crease in the podcast and all these different little pieces where they're talking about the hockey of the show as a background. They want to understand what all of that actually means, and they're doing research and they're getting into hockey, and I actually think that that is such a cool element of this show. So at great painstaking cost to myself, I rewatched this show multiple times, and I took a lot of notes. So today we're going to break down all of the hockey that I found in the show, and I'll do my best to explain all of the context and kind of explain what's realistic and what's fantasy. I do want to point out, if it's not clear, I really loved this show. So if you are a hockey fan that's like looking for a video that's going to criticize every small thing about this show, you are definitely on the wrong page. I really want to use this show to welcome new fans into this sport. And to do that, I will tell you when things are inaccurate, but I also think it's important to recognize how low budget this show was. And also when we're looking at things about like how much hockey was actually on screen, whether the skating itself was good, it's important to recognize the fact that Connor and Hudson and Francois have all said that they learned to skate for this show, and that they only had a couple of weeks to get started doing that. For me, as a hockey fan, it didn't have to be perfect. I think they do a good job of giving you the visuals that you need to understand how big of a deal these guys are when it comes to the league, and the spirit of hockey in general is very much just kind of enveloped in this show. So again, genuinely, this show is the type of thing that as a writer, as a filmmaker, I am so jealous of it existing and not being a part of it. And so that's the point of view that this video is going to be coming from. All of that being said, when we talk about the impact of this show, you have to look at how these guys have been everywhere, not just in hockey, but in other sports. And it was just announced that Connor and Hudson are going to be Olympic torchbearers. I think the reach of this show has been so incredible. And if you are feeling like you haven't necessarily found that same welcoming energy in the hockey fandom yet, I do want you to know that there are people like myself that want you here and want you to feel welcome and ask questions and feel excited. So as you're watching this video, video. If you find that you have any questions that I haven't explained properly or that you want to know more things about, if you drop a comment, I'll make sure to kind of follow up on all of those and do my best to explain everything to you. And before we get started, I do want to say, yes, this is a Boston Bruins jersey, and also it is absolutely just because of my love, Ilya Rozanov. There's a bear on this one, and that also explains why they weren't able to get the Boston Bears cleared through legal, but I do have to point out that I am an LA Kings fan and that my household is an LA Kings household, and this is just because I have this jersey. It was gifted to me by Fanatics for the Stadium series that's coming up, and it has been impossible to get my hands on an official Boston Raiders jersey, and if I had been able to, or even a t-shirt, I would be wearing that right now. So all of that being said, let's actually dive into the hockey of it all. We're gonna go episode by episode, and you should know that I have a lot of bullet points because there was actually this much hockey to break down. But we start in December of 2008 at Regina, Saskatchewan for the International Prospect Cup. This is the first time we see Shane and Ilya meet outside of this tournament. Shane is there playing for Team Canada and Ilya is there playing for Team Russia. Now in the real hockey world, the International Prospect Cup equivalent would be World Juniors. This is a tournament that happens every year, which is an under 20 tournament. These are the top prospects in every international team that are on the junior level, not the senior level. So the juniors tournament is always where you're going to see the next generation of talent and also some of the prospects that we're expecting to see in the NHL coming soon. It is completely true that we would have seen Shane and Ilya in this tournament, and also true that we probably would have been seeing them kind of pitted against each other at this point, and that there would be this conversation about if they were draft eligible at that point, which one of them would be going first and which one of them would be going second. They also both play the same position of center. On a hockey team, there are 6 positions. 3 of those are offensive positions, which are your left wing, your right wing, and your center, and the other 3 are defensive, your left defenseman and your right defenseman, as well as your goalie. Everyone on a hockey team plays one of those positions, and your offensive players, the right wing, left wing, and center, play in what's called an offensive line, and they're also referred to as forwards. So for both Shane and Ilya to be centers and also to be kind of these high-level scorers and high-level talents, it's very normal that we would be watching them at World Juniors and expecting a big conversation about which of them is going to go first in the draft. In the voiceover, when we see the two of them facing off in this tournament, we see Shane referred to as not sociable, but with the highest hockey IQ, and we also hear Ilya referred to as Boston's type of player. One of the reasons why they would specifically be talking about Boston, which we find out later in the episode, is that at this point they would have known that Boston had the first draft pick, and they're referencing this idea that Ilya may get that spot over Shane. So International Prospect Cup, the equivalent of that is World Juniors, and it is definitely a space where you would be seeing people talk about the idea that these are the 2 highest draft picks coming up, and that they would kind of be playing this game not only with the idea of winning gold for their country, but also with the idea that their gameplay matters for more than just the tournament, and does mean a lot to the teams that are potentially going to take them in the draft. Which of course, the parting line when they shake hands after the game is "see you at the draft." The timing on this is also accurate. The World Juniors does kind of happen in December and January, and of course 6 months later in June of 2009 we see Shane and Ilya meet again at the draft. The draft does move to different cities every year, and the draft that they show in this one is in Los Angeles. Ironically, the last draft that the NHL had in 2025 was also in LA, and as I have been covering the show in general, I've gotten a lot of questions about how the draft works. So one of the things that I actually think is pretty interesting to understand and also plays a good part into the show once you kind of know the background is that the teams who have the higher round draft picks are also the teams with the worst record in the season before. The way the draft order is determined is actually pretty important to understand if you want to understand where these teams would have been when they actually got Shane and Ilya on their teams. The draft order is determined by the way that you finished the season prior. So the teams who don't make the playoffs in the season before are automatically going to have the highest draft picks. Then the 4 teams with the worst record go into a lottery. That lottery determines who gets the first overall draft pick, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th as well. But those 4 teams, regardless, are going to have had the worst record in the NHL the season prior. So for Boston and Montreal to be the number 1 and number 2 draft picks, they would not have made the playoffs the season before, and they would have had pretty objectively terrible seasons, one of the worst 4 in the league. And this is something that happens across all sporting leagues. The draft is intended to go this way so that the teams with the worst record are able to get some of the newest talent to hopefully keep from one team just always being the best. So essentially, if you just gave the best team the highest round draft pick, there would never be a chance for any of the other teams to get new talent that are at the top level. But that also means that some of the best talent also ends up on some of the worst teams for a long period of time as they go into some sort of rebuilding phase. But it also means that there's usually space for a young star, especially a 1st or 2nd round draft pick, to really be the person that a team is being built around. And I think that that part is really important to understand so that you ultimately understand what Ilya would be giving up by leaving Boston. For Ilya to go 1st overall in the draft to Boston, it means that Boston was in a place where the team was was just not doing well and probably hadn't been doing well for a long time. And then, not to jump ahead too much, Ilya comes in, first overall draft pick, and pretty quickly is building a team around not only his leadership but his talent, and takes them all the way to a cup. Even though they're not winning back-to-back cups all the time, Ilya would have been the heart of this team. He would have been the reason why the team was able to kind of claw back out of obscurity into being a real team that makes the playoffs, that has a chance to win the cup. And from the moment that Shane and Ilya would have ended up in Boston and Montreal, they also would have become these really big icons in their cities. Boston in particular is a huge sports city, and Ilya would have been very beloved in that city, especially for how long he stays there. So I think from the very beginning, it's important to understand that these guys would have been going to two cities and two teams that were desperate for talent and would have been so incredibly loved by their fan base because they're actually able to bring success to these cities. And so the idea when we get to the cottage episode of Ilya being willing to give all of that up, it's a really big deal, and I'm gonna get emotional again, so let's get back to the hockey. So Ilya goes number 1 in the draft overall, Shane goes second, and some guy goes third, and I would love to be a fly on the wall when he eventually finds out that Shane Hollander and Ilya Rozanov are kissing on the mouth. I just feel like there's no way he doesn't get asked about it later on. Also, we don't really hear a lot about him moving forward, which kind of implies that we never really see him again. A couple of other context points to note from the draft sequence. The two people that we see Shane and Ilya talking to with their parents are most likely the general managers of the team. These are the guys who are pretty much in charge of all hockey operations. They're the coach's boss and they report to the owners. They're not named in these scenes, but those are most likely who they're supposed to be. These guys also would have been really locked in on picking Shane and Ilya and why they would have been right for their team, and also would have kind of a lot of their hopes for the team pinned on both of these guys before they're drafting them, which I think gives a lot of color to this scene that we see with Ilya's dad and the general manager and Ilya, where Ilya's dad calls him lazy and says that he doesn't work hard. You automatically see Ilya sort of try to head that off and say that he's going to work very hard, but also you sort of hear this surprise from the general manager because obviously he knows that none of this is true. They would have been tracking Ilya's career for a very long time before they decided to draft him, especially because he's being drafted so young. This guy would know all of Ilya's numbers, his stats, his records, he would have watched his interviews, and he would have talked to his coaches. And so for him to be surprised by it, I also think is kind of the first moment that Ilya would have ever heard someone kind of tell him that his dad was wrong, even though it's not said in so many words. I really liked this moment because I think, especially with what we learn in the show later about Ilya's relationship with his family and especially his father, it is probably a moment where Ilya not only is embarrassed by what his father is saying and is trying to keep his new boss from thinking that that's how he feels, but also probably the first time that Ilya has someone who is kind of an authority figure disagree with his dad in front of him about something negative that's being said about Ilya and his work ethic. That idea of laziness is something we see Ilya kind of talk about later, and this moment kind of gets reflected again in episode 4 with a really soft moment between Ilya and Shane. They're sitting on the couch watching hockey before their tuna melts are ready, and they talk about Svetlana and how he could go find other women to be with, but he's lazy. You see him kind of say it with this flippant tone, which he knows is what's been said about him so much in his home. And Shane pauses and says, "I don't know that side of you at all." And you get this really soft smile from Ilya in response to that. And it really kind of mirrored this moment for me from the draft when I rewatched it, of seeing Ilya kind of be validated for the second time, but also recognizing that all these years in between, Ilya still has these kind of negative feelings about himself from his father and from his family. And the only two times that we actually see it broken in front of him are both in this moment after the draft with the general manager and with Shane on the couch in a quiet, private moment before everything falls apart. And I think little things like that are part of why I love this show so much. There are these little moments that are seated in hockey that also become huge character moments later on. And that is one of my favorites. And then there's one other line that actually meant a lot to me as a hockey fan that we get from Yuna in her conversation with the general manager. This is this moment where they say that they're thrilled that Shane is Asian Canadian. And it's honestly pretty awkward and uncomfortable and something that anybody who's not white entirely has had to experience in their life. But I actually love the way that Yuna responds to that, which is that she actually turns it into this moment where she says that being a Montreal Metros fan is what made her feel Canadian, implying obviously that she's not from Canada and that she marries David and becomes a Canadian citizen, but also that Yuna, as someone who would have been an outsider, finds her identity in hockey and in being a fan of a team, which allows her to kind of shed her otherness of not being Canadian, of not being white, and put her identity in something like becoming a hockey fan. I also think that it's this moment where we then understand why hockey is so important to her over the next 6 episodes, but it's a moment that I really identified with. I felt like there was this space for Yuna to kind of say, like, my identity is tied to this team, not to something that makes me different, and not to something that makes my son different and that this team is now highlighting. She really swerves on that comment and makes it into something about being a fan of a team and an identity identity being wrapped up in that, as opposed to her and Shane's identity having to be something other than necessarily her husband's or anybody else in this room. And for me, it's such a small moment, and I've seen a lot of people talking about how they felt like it should have been a bigger part of Shane's character, but I felt like that moment in particular highlights this space where Shane and Yuna both have to feel so othered. But Yuna in particular, and probably in some of the way that she raised Shane, tries to make it clear that her identity is as a hockey fan first, and that everything else about her identity can be important, but shouldn't be the only thing that we talk about. I don't know, I may have read into that moment a lot, but for me, with hockey, as it is a very predominantly white fan base, it was a really nice moment, I thought, and also this space for Yuna as a character to have a very strong identifying line. Even though right after that line, we sort of leave that conversation and go into a longing look between Shane and Ilya. Also, I'm sure this will be edited down significantly, but I do want to say lock in for a long video. I guess I need to lock in for a long video. I've been recording for 37 minutes and we just got through the draft. But the thing about this show that is so beautiful is there are so many little things like this, like so many little lines that maybe I just felt so seen by the show. When you look at so many of these little moments and the way that Jacob Tierney really like weaves in these psychological moments that you kind of see grow all the way through the show, and also these little tiny character lines like Yuna's line, I think so much of them really speak to people who are fans of hockey or have been fans of hockey that maybe haven't felt so welcome or haven't been a part of the majority. And especially because this is a story about people who are in this world of hockey that are not a part of the majority in so many different ways, even in the supporting characters. And I'm thinking of Yuna especially in this moment. And I feel like that is why this show feels like such a warm embrace for people, not just because of a happily ever after, but also for so many people like me who have felt outside of this space in so many different ways that can get to watch how you would move through this space and it feels realistic. I just think these two moments with Ilya and Yuna really like reflect throughout the show and show such great character in such small lines. And it's so impressive to me how much hockey and emotional depth we're able to fit into tiny, tiny spaces. After they're officially selected for the draft and we know that Ilya's gone first and that Shane has gone second, we see them of course have this competitive moment in the gym where they kind of go crazy on the bikes and then they sit together and talk. Now this is a sort of inside hockey conversation that I also liked for how much tension it built, especially if you understand what they're talking about. Ilya asks Shane if it was everything he ever dreamed of, because they really both objectively have achieved their lifelong dreams in this moment. It's a sweet moment, I think, for the two of them to be on equal footing, and also a moment for Ilya to sort of offer the same thing that Shane did when they were at the Prospect Cup originally. Ilya comes with something that is the two of them on equal ground. They both have just achieved this huge thing that they've been working for their whole lives. They've now also sweat on the bike a little bit. They're both thirsty. And also they have this moment that really no one other than the other person they're talking to understands. Shane can talk about this with his parents and be happy about it, but it's not like Yuna or David really understand the impact of going in the draft and actually going so high. He is really about to play professional hockey, and the only other person who understands what that's like is Ilya. And Ilya, of course, can't talk about this with his family or talk about this with anyone that really might understand him other than potentially Svetlana. But even Svetlana is never going to be a professional hockey player, as much as I feel like she should have been. So this olive branch in the gym actually feels like this moment where we recognize that the two of them are on equal footing. Even though, as Shane breaks that moment and says, almost referencing the fact that Ilya is one step ahead of him. Shane, of course, like Ilya, dreamed of not only going in the draft at all, but being first overall and the best available. I think this quiet moment of intimacy before they've ever shared a kiss or even a locker room moment after a commercial shower shows you why these two people actually end up being made for each other. And it's because there's literally no one who understands what level they're at except the other person. One of the other things that's referenced in this conversation that sets up not only their rivalry but their romance is Ilya kind of talking about the cities. He says Montreal is nice, referencing Shane moving to Montreal, and then he also talks about Boston, and you see Shane get a little jealous given the fact that he's not going to go there, and the fact that Boston represents being the best because of that first overall draft pick, not necessarily that he's jealous about Boston existing, but also this is where we set up this idea of conferences and how an NHL schedule works. Ilya says that Boston plays Montreal quite a lot. One of the reasons why that's the case is that they're in the same division, so they are rivals. This is something that would have been by chance because of how the draft works. It wasn't necessarily certain that these two guys, or the first and second overall draft pick in any season, would end up as rivals in the same division. It just so happens that both of these two teams sucked at the same time, and so they both end up with high draft picks. But Shane and Ilya being in the same division and the same conference means that they're always going to compete against each other for the cup. The NHL has 32 teams that are broken up into two conferences, the East and the West, and also under those conferences we have 4 divisions. To make it into the playoffs, you have to be the best in your conference, which also matters where you are in your division. Not to be too complicated about the situation, to basically just explain it, for Shane and the Montreal Metros to ever make it it to the Stanley Cup Finals, I'm using this because the MLH is supposed to be the NHL. For them to ever make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, they'd have to beat Ilya directly. And that means that Ilya and the Boston Raiders can't make it past Montreal Metros to the cup. So anytime you see either of these guys hoisting the cup in the air, it's because they knocked out the other team either in their ranking or in physically meeting each other in the playoffs. So we're setting up this immediate situation where these two guys are the only two people who could possibly understand what the other is feeling. And for the best part of their careers, they're expecting to consistently have to always beat each other to be able to make it to the top level of their career. The tension that is set up in the scene is absolutely sexual and romantic, but it also sets up this massive tension for the future of their rivalry. And in these moments where Shane and Ilya are experiencing attraction for each other, it also means that there's this moment of danger, because every little bit of their professional future hinges on being able to be better than the other one. Neither one of these two teenagers who are touching hands as they pass a water bottle between the two of them are ever going to be able to hoist the cup above their head without beating the other one. And once you understand that, the tension level that is there is so insane and also delicious. The next thing that happens after the draft is they do go back to World Juniors. This is called the Prospect Cup in the show, and this is one thing that was a little odd in terms of like comparing it to actual hockey. Ilya and Shane were the number 1 and number 2 overall draft pick, and that was in June. The hockey season starts in October, and they would have absolutely started playing. Now, one thing that is important to note about the draft is that just because you're drafted does not mean that you automatically go to the NHL to start playing. If you're drafted in a lower round, or it's kind of determined that you're not ready to be in the NHL, you might go play college hockey, or you might play in the minor leagues like AHL, but the team that drafted you would also own your kind of NHL contract and have the ability to call you up to the pros at any point. So some hockey players find themselves drafted, then go play 1 year of college hockey and then get called up, or even play 4 years of college hockey and head into the NHL. Or they might have been drafted, play 4 years of college hockey, then go to the AHL, then never get called up to the NHL. There are so many different paths, and actually being drafted in the NHL as a teenager does not mean that you automatically head to that pro season. However, the number 1 overall draft pick and the 2nd overall draft pick, it would be very wild for them not to actually head directly to their teams. So even though Shane and Ilya were so young, they definitely would have reported to their teams for that season. However, the one thing that is kind of interesting about this, though definitely not what was going on in the show, is that the year that an NHL player named Alexander Ovechkin was drafted into the NHL also had a lockout, which meant that they didn't play a full season of hockey because of a contract dispute between the NHL Players Association and the owners of the teams. This meant that Alexander Ovechkin did not play his rookie season the year that he was drafted, and instead played his rookie season the following season against a little-known Canadian named Sidney Crosby, who went first overall in that draft. That year, we had 2 first overall draft picks playing their rookie season, a Russian hot-headed scorer named Alexander Ovechkin and a Canadian nice guy named Sidney Crosby. Their rivalry, which I would be happy to make a full video on for anyone interested, is the rivalry that is credited with saving the NHL after that lockout, and also has been referenced by Rachel Reed as something that was inspiration for her to write Shane and Ilya's story. I do want to be clear that this story is not based on Shane and Ilya. This is not RPF or real people fan fiction for someone who doesn't know what that term is, but it is kind of interesting that they have this secondary juniors cup that they play against each other, that they don't go directly into their rookie season after the draft, even though by all intents and purposes they probably should have. I think the reason they had that second juniors tournament in the way that they did in this show was potentially because it gave a narrative arc of seeing Shane lose to Ilya in the first Prospect Cup, seeing Shane lose to Ilya again in taking the first overall draft pick, but before they go into their actual professional season, Shane takes over and wins the Prospect Cup against Ilya. And we also get this horrible, heartbreaking line from Ilya's dad where he says, "You will not lose to him," meaning Shane. So we end up having this rivalry that's not only set up by the International Prospect Cup, but also by the draft and their MLH careers that are looming over them, as well as directly Ilya's father specifically singling out Shane as someone that he will not lose to, which of course he does end up losing after beating Shane twice in a row, and before he leaves Russia for a long period of time to actually go pro, gives his dad this extra ammunition of calling him lazy and of them having lost, meaning that Shane almost becomes this sort of embodiment of his father's disappointment in him, and sort of imbues their rivalry with that moving forward. So while it is pretty inaccurate that they wouldn't have just gone straight to going pro, and that there would have been a full season in between their draft and their actual beginning of their pro career, I do sort of see why they would have moved things around narratively, and I do think it gives you this extra beat of kind of really driving their rivalry home before they actually go pro. So again, not necessarily the most accurate, but I do think that it works and it's fine. And then we have their parting words where Shane gets the last word and says, "See you in October," referencing the start to their official pro career, which would have been their first MLH season. But because Ilya is a schemer, that is not the next time they see each other. They actually see each other 6 months later in June when they shoot this commercial together. I actually really like this commercial addition because it also really heightens how big of a deal these two rookies are. When we talk about sort of like brand deals and how much they would have been well known and commercials that they would have been doing, the idea that these two top rookie prospects are coming into a commercial together is actually pretty interesting. It does mean that whatever commercial they were filming, this promo that they were doing, it was meant for both of them to do individually before Ilya said that they should do it together. It shows a little bit of scheming and interest, obviously on the romance side, but it also shows that they were being pitted against each other before their rookie season even starts. I think this gives you kind of a good representation of how much fame they would have had going in, and also how big of an expectation there is on both of the shoulders of these kids. They're so young and they're still teenagers, and they're being thrust into this professional environment, but also before they even hit the ice, that professional environment is pitting the two of them against each other on a national and international stage. Obviously, this scene and this meeting is very important for other reasons, but I actually think there's this really nice moment where you get an idea of how big their lives are about to become, and especially when we talk about the budget of this show and actually really how economical it is, I'm always really amazed that they were able to tell as much story as they were in 6 episodes. Okay, so the next time jump is 3 months later, and now we're officially in the MLH season. At this point, we see Shane watching Ilya kind of answering press questions either in the locker room or somewhere after the game with his shirt off, and this is where that iconic line that's clipped into every edit, as it should be, comes from, where a reporter says, "Ilya, you said that you were going to score 40 goals this season. Are you still on track to do that?" And he says, "Is lie, liar told you that. I said 50. Now, to really understand like how big of a deal this is, the idea of a rookie player scoring 50 goals in their rookie season is insane. To really put this into context, Alexander Ovechkin, who I mentioned earlier in this video, plays for the Washington Capitals and last season broke the record for the most goals scored in a single career in the NHL. His rookie season, he scored 52 goals, and he is objectively the best scorer in the NHL in a long period of time, and no one is even vaguely close to hitting his record. So for Shane or Ilya to score 50 goals in their rookie season is a pretty insane task. And so putting this into context, you're looking at Ilya and Shane really being generational, shocking level talents. I think it's kind of clear because of how high the number is, but I did want to put that into context for anyone who hasn't watched hockey and this is your first experience. We're looking at Shane and Ilya setting themselves up for generational level talent in terms of their careers as point scorers. This interview definitely takes place really early on in the season as well, which sets up this idea of Ilya being so cocky. At this point, they ask about the first game against Montreal, which means that in this schedule, they have yet to actually play against each other. This would be pretty early on in the season, especially since we're about 3 months after that commercial shoot that took place in June. We're looking at sort of like the very first week of the hockey season actually tipping off. In this sequence, we also see Shane get this Rolex ambassadorship, which I think is pretty important to recognize how early, again, in this season it is. The level of stardom that these guys are coming into the league with is very, very big. And I think when we look at the tension that is kind of being put on their shoulders this early on in this first episode, really sets up the stakes that we're seeing later on when we're talking about the idea of these guys really kind of potentially coming out together one day. These are two of the biggest stars coming into the league, and these would be really record-breaking level stars that are coming in with massive endorsements and ultimately are really building a sort of economy around them. Obviously is set up as this sort of momager character who's able to pull everything together, but Shane's talent and the fact that Ilya is pretty much on the same level as him really sets up the idea of how big these guys are, not just to themselves, but to their teams, the cities that they play for, and the number of brands that are sort of pinning their hopes and dreams on them. These guys are becoming the face of luxury brands very early on, and in Ilya's case, really talking up this sort of cocky and flashy behavior. And objectively, we are probably only a couple of games into the regular season at the point of this interview and this Rolex ambassadorship. Then we do head into the first regular season game between Boston and Montreal, and we get this moment on ice that I think is actually pretty interesting and funny. Essentially, at this point in the game, it seems like Ilya and Shane have not been on the ice at the same time, at least for a face-off. They obviously have been building up this idea of their rivalry and the tension of these two guys meeting, but up until this point in the game, they haven't faced off against each other. In theory, it's interesting that they wouldn't have both been on the first line, but again, this is early on in the season, and they would have been figuring out where these guys fit. So to really understand what's going on here, you have to understand how line changes work in hockey. You probably noticed while watching the show that there are only 5 guys on the ice on either side, as well as each goalie, so 6 on each side of the ice. And you probably noticed that the bench itself was very full of other people, and they're hopping back and forth between the ice and the bench, and that the game doesn't stop while that's happening. Essentially, those 5 players that we talked about earlier in this video, they're broken up into what we call the offensive and defensive lines. So your offensive line is your center, your right wing, and your left wing. And your defensive line is done in bonded pairs, so to speak. Your right defenseman and your left defenseman. So essentially, all of your offensive players are broken into trios. And your first line is basically your starters. So in theory, at this point in their careers, very early on in the season, Ilya and Shane are not on the first line of their teams. That means that they also are probably on different lines, not necessarily consistently being pitted against each other, as Boston and Montreal both figure out sort of how these guys fit into their offense and how much they can really stand in the professional league at this level. So it makes sense that probably throughout this game, especially this first meeting, they would have been playing more of their veteran players and mismatching Shane and Ilya, not necessarily putting them on the ice at the same time. And then as we get into this change of who's getting set out for this face-off, they sort of give the people what they want and send Shane and Ilya on the ice at the same time. And that's where we get this iconic moment of Ilya saying, "Shane Hollander, will you disappoint them?" Now, it is completely normal that they would be talking smack in this moment, and in general, seeing them being sent out onto the ice in this way is something that could happen. I think it's also an interesting way, if you're following the hockey of it all, to show that these guys, even though they are such a big deal, are not necessarily 100% settled into their professional careers yet, especially given the fact that this far into the game, they haven't been on the ice at the same time, which means that they did not start the game for their teams together. And of course, whether or not any of that's true, it's just building up narrative tension of actually finally seeing them meet on the ice after all this time. In Shane's interview after, we also see him compared to Tiger Woods and Serena Williams. And I thought this was an interesting moment because it also shows why Shane and Ilya have such different kind of personas when it comes to the way that they present themselves, and also harkens back to a couple of the things that we've seen Una say up until this point. First, we had that moment where Una talks about being a Metro fan and how that made her really feel Canadian. But we also have this other moment that's private between her and Shane where she reminds him how important his presence on the ice will be to other Asian kids. And I think that this moment where we see Shane then have to kind of have a media-trained answer to being compared to Serena Williams and Tiger Woods, which again kind of points out the fact that they don't even have comparisons for him in hockey. They go to two other sports to really make that comparison, which again, I know there's also the level that in this show they're trying to make sure that they don't get kind of sued by the NHL. But I think it's also this relevant moment where it shows that Shane doesn't have the same opportunity that Ilya has to be cocky about it. And he's not being asked the same questions that Ilya is, even though they're both kind of having this big career moment and this splashy entrance onto the league. Ilya's being asked questions about being cocky and arrogant and the goals that he's scoring, and Shane's being asked questions about being compared to athletes that aren't even in his sport. One of the things that I think this show does really well are the insidious microaggressions that you would see on the public side of this space. No one's coming out and saying, "Shane, how does it feel to be an Asian hockey player?" They're coming out and saying, "How does it feel to be compared to Tiger Woods and Serena Williams, two people who you have nothing in common with other than the fact that you play sports, not even the same sport, and you're not white?" And I think there's this interesting balance because the first time I watched this show, I was like, why did they choose Tiger Woods and Serena Williams? But the second and third and fourth and fifth time I watched this show, I remembered feeling like, yeah, what do they have in common? Why would a reporter ask this question? Again, there are little moments where I think that they didn't have necessarily so much screen time to dive into so many nuances, but we also get these tiny moments where you do realize the weight that's on Shane's shoulders and the fact that if he said something, if he turned around and said, "Why would you ask me that? Tiger Woods plays golf and Serena Williams plays tennis," everyone would be like, "Why are you so upset?" I think there are these moments that really demonstrate Shane's control in such a strong way, which then becomes so important to his character and his relationship with Ilya as well. And I really genuinely love them. I just think that every little line of this show works so well. After this game, which basically essentially sets up the entire expectations of their rivalry, how they play against each other, and the questions that they're asked after the fact, we jump ahead to the All-Star game. So when we jump into the All-Star game, they set it up as Team Europe versus Team North America. And in the voiceover, they talk about the fact that the league is kind of intentionally setting these two guys up against each other. This is something I got a couple of questions about, which was like this idea that the league would be setting up this narrative or using the All-Star game to increase it. And yes, this is absolutely something that would happen. In the All-Star game, there are a couple of different components. Things like a skills competition, which is what we see Shane and Ilya break Scott's record in when they're sort of shooting those goals as fast as possible. And then you also, of course, have an actual All-Star game, which is like the best players from the league that are voted on by the fans in whatever combination the league has decided to make for that season. So in the season that we see here, it's players that are from North America versus players that are from Europe, which is a pretty strong distinction in the league. Another pretty common thing you would see would be East versus West, which we see later in this season. And it's also kind of relevant to say that this actually happens in a ton of different sports. If you look at the NBA and the WNBA All-Star game, we've seen combinations where they've done things like Team USA versus the rest of the world. And that works more so in a basketball league like that, where it is more heavily dominated by US-based players. In the NHL or the MLH here, it would make sense for that division to be Team Europe versus Team North America. But also one of the other big reasons why they would have done this instead of doing kind of Team East versus Team West is that in this whole season, which in February is when the All-Star game is, so it's kind of a good portion through the season. The season starts in October, so you have October, November, December, January. We're 4 months into that season by the time time we get to the All-Star game. We already know that from the very beginning, there's been this narrative of Shane versus Ilya, but also that because they're in the same division, if they did a typical East versus West, that would put them on the same team. So from a marketing standpoint, the league would obviously want to take on that kind of narrative and find the best way to get people to tune into the All-Star game. And the best way at this point in their career to get them to tune into the All-Star game would be for them to be playing on opposing teams. And because of where they landed in the division, the only possible way to do that is to kind of manipulate it and go with Team Europe versus Team North America. And of course, the fact that they do this joint press conference together really does highlight that. And then in this press conference, we get a lot of hockey and we also get a lot of emotional relationship building, which I really love. I do think one of the best parts about this show is that so much of their relationship is informed by the hockey of it all, and this press conference really works to show that. So just to run through a couple of these lore drops and how they connect to the actual NHL, we do get this scoring update on where Shane and Ilya stand. At this point, Ilya has scored 28 goals and Shane has scored 31. And to put that into context with their 50 goal mark that they're trying to hit, there are 82 games in the regular season, and right now in the NHL season in January, we're around a 50 game mark for most of the teams. The regular season for the NHL before the playoffs ends in like mid-April, and this year we're having a sort of escalated season because of the Olympic break that we're taking. So it's safe to say that by February for the All-Star game, they're in pretty deep on their season. But the idea of them being able to hit that 50 goal mark does still exist. Outside of those goal markers, the other big thing we get is this deep question about the idea of both of these teams being original 6 teams, and the fact that Boston has not made it to the playoffs for the last 3 seasons and that Montreal hasn't made it for the last 2. So the original 6 reference is a reference to the NHL. The NHL was originally formed with just 6 teams. Those were the Boston Bruins, the Detroit Red Wings, the New York Rangers, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Montreal Canadiens. So both Montreal and Boston are part of that original 6, and the original 6 was the entirety of the league until 1967. And that being highlighted here actually really brings in a little bit more of that element we talked about with the draft and how important these 2 players would be to the cities that they were drafted with. Not only are Boston and Montreal in sort of a state of disrepair by the time that they get Shane and Ilya on their teams, they also are teams with a huge amount of heritage when it comes to hockey and the league itself. The NHL, and by association the MLH, was literally formed around these 6 teams, and for over 20 years, those were the only 6 teams in the league. There's a huge amount of history around these teams and a desire to be one of the best because of being one of the founding parts of this league. I am not Canadian, so I can't speak to Montreal and their fan base, but I did go to college in Boston, and one of the other things about Boston is how intense they love their sports. Sports are completely integral to that city's identity and the way that it functions. And the idea of the team not making it to the playoffs 3 seasons in a row, and then getting Ilya Rozanov as their #1 draft pick, would be this basically breath of fresh hope into the city and their hopes for this team. And I think the thing that's really interesting about that is when you see Ilya actually freeze at the question, which also the question is very long-winded, which does happen with reporters from time to time, and it did make me giggle. The thing about that question and why Ilya freezes is you can literally see how much pressure is being put on this kid. And genuinely, they are still kids at this point, which is so hard to remember. But to me, Ilya and his relationship with hockey get so wrapped up in this moment where he freezes. Because up to this moment, and also what we learn later in the season, we know that Ilya and his relationship with hockey not only represent this idea of greatness and his expectations for his own life, they also represent his escape from Russia and his family, and also failure in this sport is so locked into his father's disappointment in him no matter what he does. Ilya is coming from a family where losing is not an option, which we continue to see throughout the show, into a space where now he's being asked and expected by people from the outside to basically say that he'll be able to save this team from obscurity all on his own. And obviously that's a pretty impossible ask. We also know that he's come into this situation believing that he's lazy, that he's worthless, that he doesn't work hard enough, and that no matter how hard he works, he can't seem to get things to work the right way. We see that kind of belief of his instilled in him over and over again. We see it in the Olympics in the next episode. We see it in other episodes where he isn't making it through the playoffs, where he's seeing Shane kind of hoist the cup above him. Not only do we have these moments where Ilya is being told directly to him or also to people around him that he's lazy and that he's not good enough at this, we now have him confronted in this press conference all of a sudden with every piece of negative energy he's ever received about his career. And then he's being expected to say what his plan is or his belief of how he can take this team from the bottom back to the top. And not only is he being asked that, it's being put into this context of how much heritage the team has and the fact that they're an original 6 that can't seem to get out of a rut. So for Ilya at like 19, 20, in his rookie season, he's being asked how he's going to save a team that originally started the league from obscurity, and if he's willing to work hard enough to do that. When objectively, it's an entire team. He can't do this on his own. And I think the moment where we see Ilya freeze, when you put all of that context behind it, when you put put all of this hockey behind it. And you recognize what he's being asked and how much context is behind it. It makes so much sense that he freezes, and it also makes it so much more of a deep moment when Shane takes over that question and gives him the foot tap underneath the table. Because Shane's response is actually to invoke his mother, and I thought that was really interesting. Shane has this completely different approach to hockey legacy than Ilya does. And that's because, as we talked about earlier, Yuna has kind of really made hockey this identifying personality trait for herself, which also has obviously been instilled in Shane. Shane, I think, has this element of visual otherness when it comes to his expectations in the league. His Asianness is highlighted throughout the show by outside people, but he and Yuna, in a public sense, continue to bring it back to hockey and his abilities as well as his love for the team. Shane is able to kind of relate to this idea of being a fan of the team first, of feeling that his kind of priorities of getting the team back to greatness align with everybody else's because he loves the team as a fan first, just like his mom does. And he's able to kind of pull back into that familiar relationship of two parents that actually really support him, that also help him get through this amount of expectation and pressure, even though he can't share everything about himself with them. I think this moment gives you this complete dichotomy of how Shane was raised, of how Shane's hockey kind of fits into his life and his childhood, to how Ilya's relationship with hockey and how it was in his household is completely different. When we talk about episode 2, we'll talk about Ilya's dad's relationship with the Russian Hockey League, and also how Ilya has decided to go to North America instead. And also how there's this like element from Ilya's household, how the league that he's in is never celebrated, and how for the complete opposite in Shane's household, Shane is literally living his mom's dream out. Even though Ilya gets the #1 draft spot, Shane ends up on his mom's favorite team, and a team that his mom has such a relationship with in terms of her own identity, in terms of her own Canadianness, and in terms of her own ability to fit into a space that she feels cut out of. And I think this moment in this press conference where Shane is able to bring his mom's fandom back into this space, something that she has almost brought in as her ability to assimilate, allows Shane to have this quiet and emotional connection to the team, which allows him to then shoulder this responsibility in a very different way. Whereas Ilya, by comparison to Yuna, is also someone who felt othered in his space and utilized hockey as a means of getting out of that. But rather than use it to assimilate the way that Yuna has, he's actually using hockey as a method of escape, both from his country and from his family. And so when it comes to Ilya being asked that question, instead of it being this warm feeling about the fandom that he grew up in, instead it's a reminder that if he fails at this, he also fails at his escape from things that he wants to stay away from. And again, I just feel like this show and the emotional elements of it work so well and are so heightened by its understanding and sort of celebration of hockey. And knowing how much of the hockey context is there brings all of these moments up to an even higher level, even quiet, soft, quick moments like this. And actually, at that point, Shane doesn't know anything about that when it comes to Ilya. All he recognizes is someone else who is in the same amount of pressure that he is, freezing in a moment where Shane has a chance to help Ilya out of that. And so much of that goes back to the quiet moment that they have in the gym after they're drafted, where we know that for the rest of their careers, these two guys are the only people who completely understand the pressure that the other one is under. They now have this shared secret between the two of them about their relationship and their sexuality, a secret that for Shane, Ilya is literally the only person who knows. One of the things that I'm constantly struck by in these early moments in the season, and I think kind of get heightened as we get further in, is how little Shane and Ilya really know about each other, but how easily they're able to read each other, and how easily they're able to kind of communicate with each other in something as public as a press conference like this. And then of course we go straight from this quiet moment of understanding directly into competition with the skills competition. That takedown competition is definitely something we would see in an all-star game, and they go pretty quickly through it. Ilya beats Scott Hunter's record of 8 seconds, and then Shane beats Ilya's record by over a second. So we know that they're under that 7-second range doing this. And again, it makes sense as we're continuing to highlight how quickly these guys are scoring, how intensely they're moving through their actual record spaces. By the time they get to the end of their careers, we're talking about OV level stats here. And then the kind of parting line here is we play Montreal in 2 weeks. One thing I did want to point out in terms of how quickly these timelines work, especially in like the first 2 episodes, as well as how much time is in between the hookups that they have, is how the NHL schedule works. So Montreal and Boston are in the same division. And the way that the regular season is panned out, they would play each other a maximum of 4 times in the same season, usually kind of closer to 3. The maximum number of times that these two guys are in the same city during the regular season is 3 to 4 times. And I think that that also kind of comes into play when we talk about this situationship, how long it takes and how much space there is in between them. It's pretty infrequent that they would actually be in the same city. And the times that they are, they would really be stealing hours away to be able to get there. So in this rookie season, the total number of times that they would see each other, if we pick up after the Prospect Cup and go straight to that commercial that they shoot, the commercial's before the season starts, so that would have been the first time that year they had seen each other. Then they would have seen each other at maybe 3 or 4 games total in the season. Then they would have seen each other at the All-Star game and the MLH Awards. So including a commercial shoot that they wouldn't do every year, and the maximum number of games in the regular season that they might play against each other, this is 7 times in a year that they would actually be in the same city and see each other, which makes it even more impactful when you realize that the next time they're supposed to see each other at Montreal in 2 weeks, Ilya gets snowed out of his plane. Now, the other thing that is really funny about this, that I don't even know if it was intentional, the very first weather-related delay in the NHL actually did take place because of a Montreal storm. On February 20th of 1924, Ottawa was supposed to play Montreal, but there was a massive snowstorm that ended up with the Ottawa team actually being stranded and unable to make it to Montreal. Typically, any sort of weather-related delay in the NHL is just postponed, not completely canceled, so the game generally would have been added back onto the calendar, and Shane and Ilya would have had an extra chance to actually see each other. But it kind of brings the emotional stakes up if we lose one of those 7 meetings, which really would have been 6 or 5 when you kind of take everything else out of the loop, and for that meeting to have kind of finally been this place where they were planning on meeting up and allow Shane to get cold feet later on. I do think it is funny that we end up with this sort of weather delay that's going into Montreal because of a snowstorm, and it's just sort of kismet that that was originally also a storm in 1924 that caused the very first weather delay ever. I think there's something so fun in how much of the history of the NHL and the league and this idea of tradition exists in this episode alone, and the snowstorm kind of brings a little bit more of that up. I think it also raises that tension of why Ilya is so frustrated by the loss of that meeting, because again, there are so few across the entirety of a year that they actually have a chance to meet up without it being suspicious. And of course, canceling the game instead of just delaying it adds an extra narrative layer that takes away one of those 7 meetings from this first season. And I think the timing of it and the way it's done is so good, because with this cancellation instead of a delay the way it would have normally been done, you get so much more stakes to the relationship, you get this possibility of Shane getting cold feet, and of course you have Ilya have a chance to get kind of put back into his old life with Svetlana, and you see the disappointment that Ilya has going back to the status quo and the excitement that he had to be with Shane again. I think so much of it is heightened when you realize literally how few times these guys would be seeing each other every season, and how every chance they miss is really a big deal in terms of that number of times they would actually be able to see each other. So of course, the last time they would actually get to see each other that season would be the MLH Awards. Those take place in Vegas, and that's where we find out that Shane wins Rookie of the Year over Ilya. And I really like how many times we can sort of have the tally over which of these guys is winning. If you look at the beginning of this episode, right, Ilya wins the Prospect Cup at the top, then he gets the #1 draft pick overall, then Shane wins the Prospect Cup, and then Shane beats Ilya in their first game against each other. So you're sort of tied 2-2 until you get to the All-Star game where Shane again gets the upper hand, and the scales are sort of tipped in his direction, and he ends up winning Rookie of the Year. You have this tense conversation on the rooftop where Ilya has not only just lost Rookie of the Year to Shane, but knows that he's heading home to basically go back to that relationship with his father, where we know Ilya's dad has specifically talked about Shane as someone he doesn't want to see Ilya losing to. And I think there's such an interesting way of Ilya and Shane's relationship being set up where they actually clearly have this relationship where they understand each other, they like each other, they have interest in each other, but also directly, especially for Ilya, every moment that they have in success also represents the failure of the other one. Ilya is kind of genuinely nice about Shane winning Rookie of the Year, but it also is needling at him not just because he didn't win, but because it represents his direct failure and the way that it's been compared to him by his family. Shane also says, "All you do is beat me," and is upset that Ilya wasn't willing to show his face for the one time that Shane feels like he bested him. But technically, if we look at the scales, Shane has already had sort of 2 over him, and now with this kind of fresh failure on his list, he's heading back home to a place where everyone will be needling at him and making fun of him and berating him for this newest loss. I also think it's really interesting when we see Ilya kiss Shane in this moment, where he continues to be the person throughout the entire season that pushes the public limits of their relationship, and how even after lashing out, he seeks comfort in Shane, but also in the danger that Shane represents. And what I think is so well done about this show, and about this pilot in particular, is that when you bring all of the hockey into it, you really have these stakes that are set up that are so intense for the two of them. Two people who are immensely attracted to each other, and off the bat have kind of found the only person in the world who could possibly understand what they're going through, but also two people who for the rest of their careers will constantly be pitted against each other, and every moment that they spend together is a dangerous one. Each of the moments of tenderness that we see between these two guys also stacks up with the danger of what would happen if anyone ever found out, and also stacks up with the fact that every time something bad happens that they want to comfort the other one for, it's generally because it was something positive for that person. So when we look at each win or loss of the games, when we look at things like who wins Rookie of the Year, Shane can't really comfort Ilya because he's the one who took it away from him, and Ilya can't really be happy for Shane's success in a genuine way even when he tries, because Shane lashes right back out at him. And what I thought was really interesting when I first started talking about this show while it was airing was how many people said that this show wasn't about the hockey. And I think objectively, of course, this is a show about falling in love. But I also think that this show as a sports romance does such a good job of bringing in the context of hockey as part of the relationship, not only kind of in the plot, but also in the stakes of the relationship and the stakes of the plot moving forward. As a viewer, I think this show also takes on the context of hockey and hockey culture and really welcomes a number of people who maybe aren't the majority and don't feel welcome in that space in general, and gives us multiple characters that kind of move through that space in a realistic and honest way, and tries to make space for both fans and players and athletes that are in these experiences. Whether you feel more seen by Yuna as someone who's utilizing sports to assimilate and find a way to be a part of the majority despite being an outsider in that majority, or you relate to Shane as a half-Asian athlete who's trying to make a space for himself without having to constantly talk about his race, or you relate to Shane and Ilya because of their sexuality and how they have to hide it, or you relate to Ilya and his family trauma and the space of trying to take care of a family that doesn't necessarily agree with you and who you are and what you stand for, and of course Ilya's trauma, which continues to be revealed throughout the show, and his coping mechanisms and the way that he moves through the world. Or maybe you relate to Shane and his neurodivergence. There are so many aspects of so many of the characters in this show that really highlight all of the different places that you might feel unwelcome in hockey, and also puts those people at the highest level of the game, and sort of forces this space for fans that have always existed, and reminds people how much these narratives really mean. These characters are not only representative of athletes and their experiences, but fans of hockey that already existed in these spaces, and also new people who maybe are becoming fans for the first time because this is the first time they've ever felt welcomed into the sport. I think overall the hockey of the show really matters, and that's why even just from the pilot you can already tell how impactful the show will be moving forward, and also why in 6 episodes we've seen such an impact globally, and also in the way that the NHL is talking about LGBTQ athletes. I think the fact that players are being asked about whether or not they would be welcoming in a locker room if one of their teammates came out, how we're talking about women, LGBTQ fans, and fans of color in NHL stadiums, and how we can potentially force this space to change just from the impact of this television show. I think the pilot itself is so well crafted and shows you what the rest of the show is going to be like, and also gives you so much insight as to why the show has become as impactful as it has. I think personally, in terms of how long it's taken me to do a long form YouTube video about this, has just been because I almost wanted to keep the show and my feelings about it to myself. I think this show has been really impactful for me just as someone in this space that doesn't always feel welcome here, and now I'm seeing the impact of the show across the board, and seeing how many new fans are coming into this space and trying to navigate it. And for me, I really hope that these new fans continue to take up space and demand change, because that is how these spaces change. It's when you come in and you refuse to leave. And to me, Heated Rivalry really has made such an impactful wave that can actually make a long-lasting change. If we continue to listen to these types of voices and to uplift them as we move forward, the important part is that we make change unavoidable. So those are just my personal feelings and breakdowns of how much the hockey really does matter to this show overall, just from the pilot. If there's anything from the first episode that I didn't explain that you had questions about, or anything that I explained that you want more clarification on, just drop those in the comments down below. And in the next couple of videos, I'll be breaking down the rest of the episodes and all of the different hockey context that you can get from them. So be sure to subscribe for the rest of those videos, and be sure to leave any questions that you might have about episodes 2 through 6. And of course, this whole channel is about discovering new sports and welcoming new fans regardless of the sport or your background. So if that feels like your thing, be sure to stick around.